Okay, this is the first in our series of local history storytime books. And this book that we're going to read today is called The Flying Patchwork Quilt. It's a story by Barbara Brenner with pictures by Fred Brenner. The special thing about this book is that it happened right here in Clarkstown. And although it's not a true story, many of the places you may recognize, although some have changed, because this book was written in 1965, which makes it older than me, which means it's very old. If it weren't for my mother, it would have never happened. You see, my mother collects things. She goes to antique shops and she goes to auctions and she buys old stuff and puts it around the house. But one day, my mother came home with an old pine chest. It will be a perfect place to store winter clothes, she told my father. And look at what's at the bottom of it, she added. What is it? Asked my father. He doesn't like old stuff the way my mother does. It's a piece of an old patchwork quilt, Mother said. Isn't it pretty? There's Mom. She held it up, and we all came around to take a look. I had never seen anything like that patchwork quilt. It was small, only about as big as a beach towel. And it was old. Some of the threads were barely holding together, but bright. It was just about the most rainbow-colored thing I'd ever seen. It had been made by sewing bits of cloth patches together in a sort of star pattern. Some of it was yellow and some of it was red. Some was purple and pink and green. And some of the patches were checked and some were striped and other pieces were flowered. It is pretty, my father admitted, but what are you going to do with it? It'll come in handy, my mother said. That's what my mother always says when she doesn't know what to do with one of her old things. She folded it carefully and put it away in the bottom of the chest. That was the last I saw of the patchwork quilt for a long time. It lay at the bottom of the old pine chest, and when spring came, it got covered with moth flakes and snow pants and winter hats and sweaters. Then one day, my sister was the one who made it happen. My sister Ellen is a lot younger than I am. She's only 5. She's always going through a stage. At that time, she was going through the stage where she wanted to fly. She was always trying. She tried to do it all different ways. She pinned a towel on herself like Superman. She made herself a pair of paper wings. She tried everything, and no matter how many times I said it couldn't be done, she went on trying. She held on to an umbrella and jumped off the porch. Well, one day, we were out in the backyard, and my mother came out. Carl, she said to me, I have to do a little shopping. Will you keep an eye on Ellen? Sure, I said, don't worry about a thing. So my mother drove away. There she is in the car. I was busy building a rabbit hutch in a corner of the yard. I really kept more of an ear on Ellen than an eye on her, because she talks to herself. I figured that as long as I could hear her talking, she was okay. She started to play her flying game. She started to jump off the doghouse roof. I could tell without looking that she was jumping off the doghouse roof. There were these thumping sounds of her hitting the ground. I looked over once or twice. Once I saw her standing on the doghouse with a balloon tied around her. I remember the balloon said George's Barber Shop on it. I watched her jump and land smack on the balloon, which broke with a loud pop. She picked herself up, brushed off her knees, and untied the string. I felt a little sorry for her. Ellen, I called to her, it won't work. Why don't you give up? She looked at me stubbornly. It will so work. I just haven't found the right flying thing yet. You'll see. And with that, she stomped off into the house. I sighed and went back to my rabbit hutch. A few minutes later, I looked up and, oh no, I groaned. There was Ellen, about to try flying with the old patchwork quilt. No, you don't, I warned. That belongs to Mother. Please, Carl, just this once. I'll put it right back. I just want to try it. I should never have let her. But she begged and begged, so finally I said, "All right, but promise that after you fall down with the silly thing, you will stop playing this game for the rest of the afternoon." She promised, and I helped her pin it on around her neck with a big safety pin. I gave her a hand up onto the doghouse again. Then I stood back so she could make her jump. 1, 2, 3, she yelled. "Jump," said I. She did. And now I'm not making this up. 1 minute she was jumping off the doghouse roof. The next minute there she was, floating overhead. There she was, with her sneakers dangling in my face. There she was, giggling and gliding all over the place, flying. There it is. You see her? I told you, she kept hollering as she flapped above my head. I knew the patchwork quilt was the right thing. I just stood there with my mouth open. A breeze came along and tossed her up a little higher. She began to look a bit scared. "Carl," she called, kind of funny. I grabbed for her leg and missed. The breeze got stronger. She went higher and then higher and right over the chimney. And before I knew it, the wind was blowing her over the housetops straight toward Nyack. You've heard of that. "Now don't worry, I'm coming," I shouted as I ran to the garage for my bike. And by the time I started down the driveway, she was just a tiny speck in the distance. I pedaled furiously across Wheeler Place and then down the Sickletown Road hill, craning my neck for a glimpse of that crazy quilt and my little sister. Soon I was at the Four Corners, but there wasn't a sign of her. Everything was just the way it always is at the Four Corners. There was the Clarksville Inn. There was Ted's Strawtown Grocery with the specials of the day pasted on the window, and there was Marshall's Drugstore. Mr. Marshall was sitting outside as usual, sunning himself next to the newspapers. I skidded up to him. Mr. Marshall, I panted. "Did you see my sister fly by just now?" "In an airplane or a flying carpet," he chuckled. I was in no mood for jokes, and as a matter of fact, said I, "it was a patchwork." "Oh, never mind," I said miserably. "Sorry, Carl, haven't seen her," said Mr. Marshall, "but if she lands on my roof, I'll let you know," he called after me. I coasted down the hill toward Old Mill Road. I bet you might have heard of that. Trying to steer my bike and look up in the sky at the same time. I was getting a terrible crick in my neck, and I didn't seem to be any closer to finding Ellen and the Flying Quilt. I was almost at Casa Beers' flower farm. You can see the flowers there. When I thought I spotted something, there seemed to be a blob of orange drifting above the irises. I rode over there as fast as I could, and when I got to Casa Beers, the orange thing was gone. All I could see were iris beds. You see, the Casa Beer plant iris, like some farmers plant corn, row on row of them. It was pretty hard to tell from the road whether there was a patchwork quilt with a girl attached to it among all those flowers. See the flowers. There used to be lots of flower farms in Rockland. So I left my bike and began to run up and down the rows, past all the little signs with the names of the irises on them. White Sprite and Orange Parade, Bermuda Sea and Mustard Pot, Green Spot and Tinkerbell. All the names I used to love to read to Ellen. The iris beds run right down to the shore of Lake DeForest. You've heard of that. As I came to the last clump, I looked out over the water, and there she was. There she is, see her? Right at Lake DeForest. She was doing something that looked like water skiing without water skis. Her sneakers were getting awfully wet, and she looked pretty scared, too scared even to yell. I waved frantically to Mrs. Casabier, who was digging in a clump of iris at the other end of the field. She just smiled and nodded and waved back. Mrs. Casabier is very nearsighted. Did you ever have one of those dreams where you yell for help and no one hears you? That's how I felt. But then I looked at Ellen, getting soaking wet, and I realized that it was no dream. I had to get her away from the water. She can't even swim. Try to steer, I called to her. Wrap the quilt around your arms. Flap your left arm and you'll go to the right. Flap your right arm and you'll go to the left. Which one is left? She called back. I groaned. Flap them both. She did, and slowly she began to move away from the water. There's another scene. See the pictures? As soon as she was over dry land, the wind took her higher again. I could not get close enough to grab her before she was gone, flying south like some bird taking off for the winter. The last thing I heard her say was something about wanting a tuna fish sandwich and a chocolate milkshake. I climbed back on my bike again and headed south, past the brook, past the old church and the cemetery, and past the library. As I whizzed by, I looked skyward. There she is. And there was Ellen, right smack on top of the library flagpole, hanging by the seat of her pants. Boy, I was glad to see her. Don't worry, I yelled. Help is on the way. I ran into the library. Mrs. Lowe John, I shouted, shattering the quiet of the library. Mrs. Lowe John, the librarian, hurried over, her finger against her lips. Shh! But Mrs. Lowe John, my sister is outside on the flagpole, and, well, tell her to get off, dear. We don't like children to climb on the flagpole. You don't understand. Shh! I can't help it. My sister's in terrible danger. Whatever are you talking about, Carl? There's Mrs. Lowe John. My sister has been flying all over West Nyack, and now she's caught on top of the flagpole. What? Cried Miss Lowe John, forgetting to whisper. Then she stopped herself. Carl, she said sternly, is this fact or fiction? I looked her straight in the eye. It's fact, ma'am, and please hurry, because if her pants tear. We hurried out of the library, Mrs. Lowe John and I. We ran down the library steps and into the yard. Shading her eyes, Mrs. Lowe John looked up to the top of the flagpole. I looked up too. There was nothing there. I looked at Mrs. Lowe John, and she looked at me, and no use even trying to explain to her. I just turned away, got on my bike, and rode off. It's a good thing boys my age don't cry. Well, let's face it, I said to myself, you have lost your sister, and nobody can help you because nobody will believe you. I thought about going to the Clarkstown police and trying to make them understand. I thought about saying to them, you see, my sister's flown away. She was wearing this patchwork quilt, and I shuddered at the thought. Might as well go home. I walked my bike back up the long hill. My legs were aching. I had a terrible pain in my neck, and I wasn't looking forward to explaining everything to my mother. When I rode into the driveway, my mother's car was there. I went to break the news. My mother was in the kitchen fixing supper, just as if there hadn't been a catastrophe. I walked into the kitchen. Mother, I said to her, there's been a catastrophe. A what? Said my mother, turning around. Where? Right here, but it wasn't my fault. There she is. I'm sure it wasn't, said my mother, looking worried. But tell me about it. It's Ellen, I said, my mouth dry and my heart thumping. Yes, I meant to speak to you about that, my mother said. Didn't I tell you to keep an eye on her? When I came home, you were gone. I tried to watch her, but she was too hard to follow, I said desperately. Mom smiled. How could she, at a time like this? Now come on, Carl. She's probably been sitting up in that apple tree ever since I left. What tree? Where? I gasped. Mother pointed. I ran to the window. I could hardly believe my eyes, but sure enough, there was Ellen sitting in the apple tree at the far end of the yard, talking to herself a mile a minute. I ran past my mother out into the yard. I climbed up next to Ellen, trying to keep myself from doing something foolish, like kissing her. Where have you been? I hissed, acting real mad. I couldn't help it, Carl, she said. Patchwork Quilt made me do it. I tried to turn. I tried to go lower. I just couldn't. It was ever so scary. But it was great fun, too, she added. And then I kept wishing that I could get home. And then I remembered what you said. about flapping, and I flapped my arms real hard, and all of a sudden I was here, and now I'm caught on this tree, and I can't get the quilt off, and I don't want to tear it because Mom will be, and will you help me down, Carl? Carl? I was only half listening. Now that she was safe, I had begun to think about what had happened that morning. That strange, wonderful, crazy quilt. A person could fly with that quilt on. I thought about pinning the quilt on myself. I thought about flying to visit my grandmother in Newark, New Jersey, or my uncle in Phoenix, Arizona. I thought about flying to New York City over the George Washington Bridge. Do you have to pay a toll if you go over the bridge, I wonder? I sat there in the old apple tree, just dreaming about flying around with the patchwork quilt. And of course, I said to myself, you'll have to learn how to steer the thing. Of course, I answered myself, I'll start right away, right after school tomorrow. My flying dreams were interrupted by my sister, who kept saying, please help me get down. I'm caught and I don't want to tear the quilt. I looked behind her. Sure enough, Ellen was all tangled in the quilt, and the quilt was all tangled in the tree. I decided to unpin Ellen first. While I was unpinning her, I talked fast. Now remember, not a word about this to Mom. She doesn't even know we have the quilt. I'll smuggle it into the house, and I'll put it back in the chest. Quick, scoot now. Down she went and ran into the house. I untangled the quilt and hid it inside my shirt so my mother wouldn't see it. As soon as I got into the house, I raced upstairs. I was just about to put the quilt back in the pine chest when the thought struck me, why wait? Why not take a ride that very night? So instead of putting the quilt safely back in the chest, I took it into my room. That night I could hardly wait for everyone to go to bed. Ellen was asleep early, but my mother and father sat on the front porch for a long time. Finally, I heard my mother say, let's go in, dear, it's getting breezy. And then I heard the screen door close. Everything was set for the takeoff. My plan was to climb out on the roof and launch from there. The quilt was ready on the windowsill. I slipped the jacket on and stuffed an apple into my pocket in case I got hungry. Quietly, I opened the window. A rush of cool air blew into the room. It was getting breezy. I stood there for a minute, looking up into the dark night sky. There he is. There was a moon that would help. I picked up the quilt and slung it around my shoulders. Well, here goes, I muttered. Then shucks, what happened to the safety pin? I put the quilt down and turned to get another pin from my dresser. What happened? In that moment, it happened. The wind caught the quilt and blew it over the sill and out the window. I made a wild grab for it, but too late. As I watched in horror, it slid across the roof and off the edge. The breeze lifted it, and it began to climb higher and higher. In 2 minutes, it was out of sight, gone, vanished. We never saw the patchwork quilt again. I'd think I dreamed it all if it weren't for my sister Ellen. She remembers everything. My mother remembers too, in a way. Every once in a while, she says, I wonder what became of that pretty little quilt that was in the pine chest. There he is. Then my sister gives me that look as if to say, why don't we tell them? But I shake my head. Nobody would believe us. Ellen's out of her flying stage now, but I still have a scientific interest in flying. For instance, my mother came back from an auction the other day with an old hooked rug. It looked just like an ordinary rug, but it may have possibilities. If someone were to take that rug to a fairly high place, say, the top of a doghouse, and if someone were to sit in the middle of it and then push off, well, who knows? The end. I hope you enjoyed this book, The Flying Patchwork Quilt by Barbara Brenner, illustrated by Fred Brenner.